Hey everybody, good morning, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you. You may regret that, but we'll see what happens here. I'll try to make it entertaining. Is it possible to lower some of the lights up in the front? If not, it's not a big deal. And there's always a risk that you'll fall asleep if we turn off the lights, of course. But so I decided to make this curious-looking title because I'm interested in each of the subjects there, so we'll move along. And my disclosures: Joe Boy and I and some other folks here go to an organization you may have heard a little bit about called Houston Oasis, which is a local secular community. And if you're secular or think you might be, or even if you're not secular, we welcome you to come to Houston Oasis activity. They're generally on Sunday mornings. I am on the board of directors of Houston Oasis, but I do not today. I'm not speaking in that capacity, so I am not speaking for Houston Oasis. These are my own views. And now, believe it or not, I'm going to probably butcher the Malayalam language here. And I realize that most of you probably live in the area, but for a couple of you that may have recently come from Kerala, I'm going to say Hustanaleka Swagatam. Is that right? Yeah. And Najan Matha Vishaswayela, something like that. And Matetara Samuham. We are Matetura Samuham, so I probably just said something inappropriate, but there it is. You can correct me afterwards. So I was born in the northeastern U.S., and then when I was 1 year old, my parents moved to Spain, and I have no Spanish blood, but I grew up in Spain because that's where the family was. An example there of, depending on which random things happen to you in life, we sometimes change tribes or switch tribes or add a tribe. So we're going to talk about tribes because that's in the title, so I have to talk about that. And I'm an addiction doctor. I started out as a family doctor, but I've always been interested in addiction. And I think there's a lot we can do to help people that are struggling with addiction. I work mostly with people that have opioid addiction, where they've become addicted to things like heroin and pain pills and fentanyl. And I'm interested in public health issues also. So we'll talk a little bit about tribes. Probably nearly all of you are too young, but some of you I know will have seen or heard about the movie from 1966 called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. How many of you have seen that movie? Okay, so maybe half or so. And the rest of you should see the movie, I think. If for nothing else, the music is wonderful, actually. And if you don't like Western movies as a genre, then you might not like it. But anyway, I brought that out because this has the title of the movie. Even if you don't like the movie, the title has become part of the language in English. And so with tribes, there's a good aspect and a bad aspect, and sometimes a downright ugly aspect. But we are tribal by nature, right? That's the human condition. And as I said, we often have many tribes. Sometimes we switch tribes. Sometimes we leave one tribe and go to another. That's something that historically has probably affected women even more than men, because if a woman marries into another family, then she is gaining a new tribe there and sometimes losing another tribe. So, but family, of course, is one of our tribes, but also sometimes people in the workplace, our religion, if we are religious, That's another tribe, and other associations that we get involved in. Even fans of a particular sports team. I'm going to guess that there's 1 or 2 cricket fans here, and so that can be another tribe, right? And we can get very passionate about these things, and even irrational, and as long as we're not being violent about it, that's okay. Go ahead and be irrational about something, passionate, if you will. Typically, even though I like certain sports teams, when I move to if I move to a new city, I try to identify with whatever the sports teams are of that city. I figure that's a new tribe. Being in that city is a new tribe, so that's something I can get behind. And with tribes, sometimes tribes cooperate with each other. Sometimes sometimes it causes conflict. Humans we like to believe that nearly everything we do is intellectual, right? I'm so smart, I decided to do this and I decided to do that, and I don't have any irrational beliefs. Now that's an irrational belief right there, of course, right? And what comes first? Are we in a tribe and that tribe happens to have some beliefs, and then we just accept those beliefs? That's not terribly intellectual, that's random. Or do we say, you know what, I believe X, and now I'm going to try and find a tribe that is connected with that? Well, obviously it's a little bit of both. It could be either one. But it's interesting to me, some of the experiments they've done to see how easy it is to arouse tribal feelings in people. It turns out it's remarkably easy because we're built this way. And tribalism, I think, is mostly a biological phenomenon. Now here's the old debate, do we have free will or don't we? And I'm going to guess that nearly everybody in this room passionately, there's another tribe right there, passionately wants to believe that we do have free will. And for a number of years now, I have, based on just reading science, I have concluded that we have about 90% not free will, and 10%, now these numbers are kind of made up, obviously, but so I think we mostly don't have free will, but we have a little bit, and so it behooves us, it helps us if we can find out by reading science which aspects of our behavior are in fact not something that we chose. And I'll give you an example of that. Because again, and we get very attached to the idea of whether we have free will or not, like I suggested. I do encourage you to get a book or to read a book here by Robert Sapolsky. This book just came out recently, and it's called Determined, A Science of Life Without Free Will. And again, people get very passionate about this. What do you mean I don't have free will? Well, if you want to challenge your beliefs on that, then I dare you to read this book, okay? And I'm about halfway through the book myself. But like I said, I already had come to the conclusion that we do have a little bit of free will. I think he's even more radical than I am. I think he feels that maybe we don't have any. On some level, of course, maybe it doesn't matter if we think we have free will, right? If we don't have free will, then we can just do whatever we want because it's predetermined. But I think, like I said, I think we have a little bit, but then we need to try to find out which parts of our behavior are sort of automated or semi-automated. So there's a hormone that some of you may have heard of called oxytocin. And oxytocin, nature or evolution, rather than always coming up with a new molecule to do a particular function in the body, it often looks in the molecule library first, and if it sees a molecule there that could be used for this purpose, it will go ahead and use it, rather than coming up with a new molecule. So that's the case with oxytocin. So oxytocin, among other things, when we have high levels in our blood, it makes us more caring and more tender to people that we identify as being in our tribe, however we define that, right? Well, that's a nice thing. It's nice to be more caring and more tender to people that are in your tribe. But remember I talked about the good, the bad, and the ugly? The ugly side of that is when we have high blood levels of oxytocin, it makes us more hostile, more antagonistic, sometimes more violent to somebody we perceive as not being in our tribe. And this came up, for example, after World War II. They had what they called the Nuremberg trials, where the Nazis in particular in Germany were, many of them, especially the leadership and whatnot, were put on trial for crimes against humanity and whatnot. And it turns out one of the things the Nazis did very well was they filmed everything. They wanted to record all this stuff, and so they did a lot of filming of their events and activities, and so that's one of the reasons we have a huge amount of documentary evidence, film evidence of what the Nazis were up to. People would often look at these films and they were puzzled because they said, well, wait a minute, the Nazis did all these horrible things, and yet they were very tender to their children. And people were genuinely puzzled about that, and I get that. I think there is a reason to be puzzled by that. How can we be incredibly inhumane and then turn right around and we're instantly super caring and loving and stuff like that? And I think part of this, now oxytocin isn't the whole explanation. I'm not going to lay all of existence at the feet of this one poor little molecule. But anyway, it's interesting that a lot of times we think we decided to think something, and in fact sometimes it's biology. So I just think that's interesting. And this is a duplicate slide. So, but I love some of these studies that have been done by psychologists who had to come up with something for their PhD thesis. And so they've done these studies where they take usually college students and they do things like they get a group of 100 of them and they say, okay, you 50 over here, you're going to wear, and perhaps based on something like, the first letter of your last name or something, they'll say, okay, you're going to wear the yellow shirts, and these other groups, these other people over here are going to wear the green shirts. And then they'll come up with various nonsense things, and people even know it's nonsense, but anyway, they very quickly, maybe they have them playing games to be a little bit competitive and that kind of stuff, and people very quickly, like sometimes within minutes even, will become very tribal, even though these are complete strangers, and they've just been assigned, something that allows them to distinguish their tribe from the other tribe, and we very quickly become tribal. So I think this is the kind of thing that if we know more about this kind of stuff, maybe we can guard against it. I'm a big believer in expanding our tribes, and really, we're all human, right? If we're humanists, then by definition, all of humanity is our tribe. Okay, so this is a corn cob or an ear of corn, so make sure you'll find out why on the next slide. You don't want to say this the wrong way. In the Christian Bible, there's a passage called Judges 12:6, and if I get it wrong, I've got an ex-minister in the back who's going to tell me that I got it wrong. Did I get that wrong? Judges 12:6. So I probably said it wrong, but anyway. So in this particular passage in the Bible, there were two tribes of Israel, and they were ethnically identical, linguistically nearly identical, spoke the same language, but they were from slightly different areas, and so they had some differences in accent, not even differences in language, just differences in accent. And they couldn't really easily distinguish one from the other, except by the accent, right? And we're all familiar with this because I'm sure in Kerala, for example, there are cities where people have this accent, and cities where people speak the other accent, and so they were fighting. Of course, they're humans, so they were fighting, right? And there was a river, and there was one tribe on one side that pronounced the word ear of corn. Their word was shibboleth, and they pronounced it one way. But they wanted to be able to determine who was from the other group as they crossed the river, because they wanted to be able to kill them, right? And so this is like, and Tim can tell me if I'm wrong on this, but it comes out being kind of like guidance from God on how to use language to discriminate against another group so you can kill them. Tim, I'm sure, will correct me on this later, but that's my understanding of the passage. And so if you pronounced it, when these people would come over, they would say, which group are you in? Okay, and if they said they were from your group, you would say, okay, pronounce the word, pronounce this right here, and they would hold up an ear of corn, and if they said sibboleth, then they would kill them. If they said shibboleth, then they would not kill them. Instructions on how to discriminate against somebody right there in the Bible. And so that led to 42,000, according to the Bible. 42,000 people were killed because they had the wrong pronunciation of ear of corn. This is a picture that is supposed to tell you about trauma. Hopefully you're not traumatized by it. But so I'm interested in trauma, among other reasons, because as an addiction doctor, about half or more of the patients I deal with that have addiction have experienced trauma, sometimes childhood trauma, and sometimes as adults, sometimes both. And then it doesn't cause addiction, but for a person who has experienced significant trauma, it makes it easier for you to get addicted to certain substances. And that can be, again, physical trauma, it can be psychological trauma, emotional trauma. If it's bad enough, it can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Typically, this is a condition that is developed in some people, because some people are more resilient for reasons that we're not altogether clear on. Some of that may even be genetic, right? But if you think that something was threatening to your life, for example, a bad car accident, and maybe you didn't get injured that badly, but you thought you were going to be injured that badly, or maybe you were injured badly, because you thought your life was in danger, then that puts you at risk for developing PTSD, and then at risk also, under certain circumstances, for developing an addiction. And it's the perception, it isn't the event, it's how the individual perceives that event. That's what determines whether they will have post-traumatic stress disorder. And interestingly enough, there's a psychiatrist who is also interestingly enough, she's a psychiatrist, actually a child psychiatrist, but she's also a climate activist. So she has a lot of adolescents, for example, that express a great deal of concern to her about whether the planet they're going to develop in and grow up in, are they going to have a livable future? And this is a very common concern among her adolescent patients. And so she came up with the term pre-traumatic stress disorder. Worried about what's going to happen in the future, and it looks similar to post-traumatic stress disorder. And I wish for all the people that aren't doing anything about climate change, I'm talking about the leadership and whatnot, although probably each of us as an individual also, but especially for the leadership, the ones who just blithely say, okay, we'll do whatever we want and nobody cares, But how do you look your child in the face? How do you look your grandchild in the face and think about their future when you do things like this? So this person was obviously traumatized because they have a big hole in their head. But so I wanted to talk about the brain a little bit, and trauma actually changes the brain. You know, it can change parts of the body also, but in particular, and of course the brain is just part of the body, but it's not just psychological changes. These are sometimes physical and chemical changes, and some of these changes, when you have significant trauma, especially repeated trauma, it can be seen on imaging. And ACEs is something that some of you may have heard about, but it's an important thing. ACEs is adverse childhood experiences, and this is something that empirically has been seen to sometimes be significant when children have traumatic events in childhood. That could be the death of a parent, a divorce, violence, chronic illness, like I say, a car accident, anything where it makes you worry about your existence or maybe even your identity. And it's been noted empirically that if people have more than a certain number, 2 to 3 ACEs, then they have an elevated risk of developing certain conditions. Again, it doesn't mean that they will develop those conditions, simply that that's an individual that we need to keep an eye on and maybe be aware of what's going on and try to prevent problems. Two sides of a coin. I don't even remember what this was about, but let's see. Oh yeah, love and addiction. So they're not similar. They're really, in a sense, the same thing. And the circuits in our brain that allow us to love another individual, whether it's a child or a partner, it's not similar to, it's not analogous to addiction. These are the same circuits. And when people find something and they use it, now most people who use drugs do not get addicted. That's simply what the evidence shows. A lot of people think, oh, if you use drug X one time, you're going to get addicted. The evidence does not show that. And there are people who use, and you can name the most addictive drug you can think of, but there are people who use that drug intermittently, and most people, the evidence is very clear on this, most people who use drugs do not get addicted. But some do, and of course, hopefully we can provide some kind of assistance for people like that. And there are so many people who, and again, sometimes there are people who have experienced trauma. For others, it may be a genetic thing. You know, maybe they have fewer receptors of a particular kind in their love circuits, right? If your brain developed in such a way that it's harder for you to feel, and this may be the case, for example, in some people who are on the autism spectrum, for example, you know. But if your brain developed in a slightly different way, it may make it easier for you to get addicted. But there are so many people with addictions who have said that the first time they tried what's called their drug of choice, whether it's cocaine or alcohol or opioids, the first time I tried that drug was the first time I felt normal. First time I knew what it was like to feel normal. First time I felt happy. There are some people, especially people with childhood trauma, childhood abuse, who may have never felt good, right? And you can't tell by looking at somebody, right? But then the first time they tried a certain drug, an external molecule that goes into those same circuits, and it's predictable, you know each time you take that drug, it's going to make you feel more normal. How can that not be appealing to somebody who has experienced trauma in this way and it's made changes in their brain? You know, sometimes we look down our nose at people with addictions, but what I've learned working with people with addiction is that, and this won't surprise you, it turns out they're just regular people. They're just normal. Maybe they have issues that we can help them with, but they're just regular old people. Pro-social, you know, things that make it easier for us to be social. That's the duplicate slide there. So, and we all have neurotransmitters in our brain of various kinds. Some of them are involved in these circuits, the love circuits or the addiction circuits. You know, the endorphins, also called endogenous opiates. These are opiate drugs that our own brain makes. You know, we look down our nose at somebody who uses some of these things, but like I tell my patients, I say every human that ever lived, their own brain makes these molecules. So if somebody wants to say, oh, I've never used drugs in my whole life, well, you've actually been using drugs your whole life, and it's already in your brain, and your brain makes these chemicals, by the way. But maybe your brain makes an adequate supply of these things. Maybe the other person next to you who struggles with addiction, maybe their brain doesn't make an adequate supply of those chemicals. You know, we're quick to judge, you know. Another example of tribalism, I guess. And virtually every addiction boils down to dopamine eventually. But there's other things that happen along the way. This is these are tea plants on your left and the opium poppy on your right. And there's a fascinating history there. India, of course, has a very long history in connection with the imperialism from England, making Indian farmers grow opium, not because India needed that, but because England needed it to go to China and then try to compel the Chinese to import their opium grown in India. Why was England doing this? Well, it's because England had gotten addicted to Chinese tea. And it was seriously affecting the balance of payments from England to China. And so it's fascinating. It's like this, it's like drug A versus drug B, right? Oh, we got addicted to drug A. Well, we have to go around and get them addicted to drug B, and we'll use India in the meantime to, you know. So it's a fascinating history. And yeah, and opium, one of the reasons opium is used, of course, is that many people have pain conditions from injuries or one thing or another. And am I over time yet? Oh, okay. So I have a tendency to go over on time. So, but opioid medications are extremely effective for pain. Now, should we try to find alternatives? Absolutely, including no medication. If sometimes we can do things to help somebody with their pain that don't involve medications at all. Well, that should be the first thing we do, right? but at some point, some people will need opioid medications for pain. And if they are prescribed appropriately and monitored appropriately, then they're safe and extremely effective. And we shouldn't deny somebody who is experiencing significant pain this benefit. It's the reason that humans have been using opioids of one kind or another, or opium-related products for at least 5,000 years. And it looks like Europe was the first place that this was done. Of course, there was no Europe at that time, but in what is now Europe. And anytime there's a war of any kind, because it increases injuries, it greatly increases the demand for opiates or opioids. In fact, in the U.S., which is now struggling with an overdose crisis, in part, not entirely, but in part because of opioids and stuff. People sometimes call it the opioid crisis. I prefer to call it the overdose crisis, or the untreated addiction crisis, you could say. And that increase in the use of morphine and opium and related products was after the Civil War, 1865. That's when Americans started using more morphine and opium, some of it grown in India, some of it grown in Turkey and other places. And I mean, wars are insanely stupid, but they also increase demand for opium. So. And I just learned about this book in preparing this talk. I learned about this book by the Indian writer Amitav Ghosh, talking about, and this book just came out, talking about the history of this stuff called Smoke and Ashes. I've already bought it, but I haven't read it yet. And he talks about this whole thing between India, China, England, concerning the opium trade, yeah. Smoke and ashes. And my slides will be available to anybody who wants them, by the way. I've been attending this Houston Oasis for about 11 years. It started 11 years ago, 12 years ago, I guess, here in Houston. So it's exciting, actually, to come to a meeting of folks who are involved in something similar in Kerala. I actually started learning about Kerala around 2001 when I was in graduate school, and I was studying preventive medicine and public health. And anytime you study public health, especially international public health, you are going to hear about Kerala, because Kerala has done such a remarkably good job with many public health programs, especially showing how to do effective public health even if you don't have a large budget. So Kerala for many years, and so that term Kerala kept coming up. Kerala, we're going to study Kerala now. Okay, now here's an example from Kerala, and it was just amazing. So I was really intrigued with Kerala ever since then, and so I applaud the good folks in Kerala for some of the great things that you've done in public health. So, and so I noticed over the years of going to Houston Oasis, I would, as I got to know people who were new to the group, they would often comment, and sometimes they would get up in front of the group and comment on this, how many of them felt like this new community, when they had been searching for community, they felt like it saved them. Especially pandemic and all that kind of stuff, where all of us felt a little more isolated and whatnot. But also, if you've left your religious tribe and then you feel like you don't belong anywhere, to find another tribe where you feel welcome, regardless of your belief. And by the way, we have folks going to Houston Oasis who are still religious themselves. So we don't exclude people who happen to be religious. You can believe whatever you want to believe, basically, and if you enjoy the community and the folks there, recognizing that it's an expressly secular community, but it does not exclude people who haven't made up their minds yet, shall we say. And I thought Joe Boy's example was interesting there, where it looked like, what was it, if I remember this right, atheists on some level are actually agnostic, and religious people are also. And so atheists are religious people when you think about it, because everything equals everything else, which is very interesting. I also thought the other talk was interesting, where it mentioned scientific temper being in the Indian Constitution, which I thought was fascinating, and I hadn't heard that before. So this is all about building secular community, but secular community, in my opinion, that is not exclusive of others. Most people in the world are somewhat religious, and if we cannot have dialogue with people, and I realize sometimes that is difficult because of their attitude, not necessarily our attitude, but if we really. If we want to grow these communities, then we want to make it kind of a big tent and a welcoming tent, where somebody who is still working on what their beliefs are feels welcome there, doesn't feel excluded. So that's my suggestion. And most of the people at Oasis were religious at one point. Now they're not. And as humans, we tend to be dogmatic. We think, if I come up with a brilliant argument, I'll just defeat all enemies. Again, we're getting tribal. But and I enjoy those arguments too. Don't get me wrong. Right? I'm as human as anybody else. And so, but increasingly at Oasis, we are trying to do what we call interfaith, I don't know if they have much of that in Kerala, but I imagine you do. Interfaith groups where you have people with different beliefs. Usually when you have these interfaith groups working on different things, that doesn't usually include a secular group, but it should. You see, and where the purpose, when you're doing interfaith work, the purpose is not to convince somebody they're wrong, but it's to work on some other thing, some other activity, and then people learn that, surprise, surprise, you're normal. You know, you don't breathe fire, you don't eat children for breakfast, or at least a very small number. And then people start thinking, well, gee, maybe I can consider this, you know. And so be nice. I can see that you're nice already. I can tell, because I'm a doctor. I can tell just by looking at you that you're nice. And you know, talk with people who are not in the tribe. You know, make it a bigger tribe. You know, and yeah, the human tribe is everybody. Here's some people from what's called the Vietnamese hill tribes. You know. So all right, that's it. And I have 10 more minutes apparently. If there's any Q&A, do we have questions and answers, or we can go on to the next speaker or whatever.
Hello. Thank you, sir. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Richard. It was very informative. Being a nurse, recently I hear from educated patients that to avoid opioid addiction, they take weed or marijuana, edible or inhaled, more frequently, and it's indirectly advised by their own doctors. So can you explain?
Yes. Well, that's a big topic. Now, as you know, the marijuana plant or the cannabis plant has, you know, thousands of molecules in it, but two of the more significant ones are THC and CBD, and they interesting. I just saw an article, I think it was yesterday, that they've discovered that there's a common plant in Brazil. I'm going to guess that there's a common plant elsewhere also. A common plant in Brazil that has CBD in it, but no THC. And so the problem that we get into is that there may be, because we're still learning this, there may be some ways in which CBD is useful to people for certain health things, but it usually comes with a bit of THC mixed into it. And if you're not interested in the THC part is the part that gets you high and whatnot. So, but there are people who are interested in both, and there are people who are interested only in the THC part. It's honestly quite early, and we don't really have a clear understanding of this. It used to be thought that marijuana could not be addictive. And we now understand that it can be, actually. And again, as with other drugs, most people who use a small amount of marijuana occasionally, most of them will not get addicted. That's just what the number shows. The problem, of course, is that today's cannabis plants or marijuana plants are more potent than they used to be. And you have various different ways that the people selling it, especially in an unregulated marketplace, there are ways that the people who make up these products will make it stronger, and then people don't realize how strong it is, and that's where people can get into trouble. And so it's way early. There are certain things that we know it's useful for. For example, you know, cannabis extracts have been found to be very effective for certain pediatric seizure patients that cannot be helped by anything else. So there's a few things where cannabis is known to be beneficial if used appropriately. But yeah, like I say, in an unregulated marketplace where you buy something and there's no regulation that governs the purity of what you're buying, and it says it's 13% THC, but in fact it's 48%, and you don't know because nobody's checking it. That's where we have to be really cautious, I would say. So yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Richard.
Sure.
I have a couple of questions and one comment. Yeah, the comment is that, I, as a medical doctor from Kerala, I used to be very proud about the Kerala public health and its indexes. And, once I started working here in US, I'm a person used to brag a lot. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm a bragging person, but there's a content when I brag it, but the time when I work with my colleagues, I tell my colleagues that Kerala is a little bit different than the rest of the country, and they give an expression looking that are you bragging? And I'll tell promise, mother promise, ammachiyana njan brag in this case. So that's the comment. My question is that, so I really thank you that you bring that to all the audience and for the future virtual audience. And my question that in the tapestry of humanity, what is diaspora? After coming to US, I hear a lot about diaspora and Indian diaspora. And can you just give a definition about diaspora and the relevance of diaspora in the secular world and beliefs?
Yeah, wow, that sounds like a big topic. The honest answer is no, I can't I can't tell you anything about that. I think obviously when there's a diaspora of any kind, that's automatically a tribe that you may or may not feel welcome in. I mean, probably you will feel welcome in it, but sometimes when people have experienced trauma of one kind or another, occasionally maybe they're not interested, or if they feel like they've been judged because of certain lifestyle things or whatever, then some people may not feel comfortable in their diaspora. And so that's a complicated question. It's obviously wonderful to have a diaspora of any kind as long as it was voluntary. Some diasporas were not voluntary, of course. Yeah, so that's just another tribe, and I hesitate to speak as if I were knowledgeable about the Indian diaspora or the Kerala diaspora because I'm relatively ignorant and I hope to learn more. So, but thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, Sai. Oh.
Thank you, Doctor, for that wonderful presentation. I would actually like to hear your thoughts, or I would really appreciate if you could share your thoughts on mostly on substance use or drug abuse. So the context I'm coming from is we have seen that war against drug have failed miserably. That's what the studies have shown. That is our experience in the last 40 years. So in Kerala, particularly, we have seen a lot of substance use cases coming up, and we are still treating that as as a criminal issue rather than as a brain disease with a chronic and relapsing nature. So I want you to share your thoughts on that, more towards Kerala audience, so that they can identify and take away from what the experiences we had in fighting drugs on a criminal level for the last 40 years. That's my one thing, Doctor. And second thing, I'm so sorry. This is more in a Texas context, where we are, the policy-wise, we are facing a lot of hurdles in harm reduction strategies with the loss of, drug paraphernalia and 911, Good Samaritan law. The exceptions that are in those laws are preventing from providers and also people who are, suffering from substance use to seek help. And I want you to, share your thoughts on that as well.
Sure. No, those are great topics. Thanks for bringing that up. And before I forget, you mentioned getting care to people who need it. In some cases, that's easier than in other cases. The U.S. healthcare system, although it's remarkable in some ways, is miserable at making healthcare affordable and accessible to people. But I will say, if somebody is struggling with an opioid addiction in particular, where we have good medications for this, if somebody doesn't have insurance or doesn't have a lot of money, there are programs, even in Texas, surprisingly enough, for free care. I work at a couple of clinics where even a patient with no insurance at all, even homeless people, which there shouldn't be any, but there are. And so actually for opioid care, even in Texas, the care can be completely free, if you can get to the clinic. Now that's the other thing, you know. But so everybody should know about that. And then the other thing having to do with the war on drugs, unfortunately, the United States, I don't want to say that it started the war on drugs, but in some ways it did. And in particular, there was a drug czar. You know, countries will often have a drug czar, the person that's in charge of drug policy, right? And historically, it was a cop. It was a policeman, somebody who could crack down and whatnot. And but it turns out that those policies almost always caused more problems rather than fewer problems. But it was done from a moralistic perspective. And you shouldn't do drugs. Therefore, if you do drugs, unless it's one of the approved drugs. Now, if you're using one of the approved drugs like alcohol or whatever, then you're a good old boy, and there's no problem with that. You know, and sometimes that changed over time. You know, 100 years ago, for about 13 years, there was the alcohol prohibition, and alcohol was illegal. But some of the people that were advocating that alcohol be banned, some of them were using the over-the-counter opium products of the day, and they could be pillars of the society using these over-the-counter products while engaging in the meetings in the evenings to ban alcohol. You see, it's often completely arbitrary and random. And as a general rule, there's very good evidence, as you know, for around the world and around the country where different jurisdictions have tried different policies on drugs. Whenever it's made stricter, whenever people are given longer prison sentences or whatnot, typically the drugs and addiction problem increases. This is what Portugal discovered in 2001, for example. Leading up to 2001, Portugal kept trying different policies because they were having a heroin addiction crisis, and they kept applying what some people called the American solution, which is to imprison people for longer and harsher penalties and that kind of thing. But they noticed that it got worse every time they did that. And then they said, okay, let's study the issue, and then let's come up with a different policy. And they ended up deciding to decriminalize, not legalize, but decriminalize all drug use. And then they had a definition of what constituted drug use versus drug dealing. Well, they would weigh the amount of drug you had, and if it was less than a certain amount, then that was considered personal use. If it was more than a certain amount, that was considered dealing. And they still deal harshly with the dealers. The penalties are the same. But they decided that it didn't make sense to punish people for personal drug use, because prison's not good for your health either, right? And Portugal viewed this from a very community-oriented perspective. They figured anybody in the country who's having this issue, these are our neighbors, these are our children, our parents, our siblings. You know, let's view this from a neighborhood perspective, a neighbor perspective, and so and ever since then, by the way, the rate of new cases of HIV, Hep B, Hep C from drug use, after they decriminalized all drug use, the rates of these infectious diseases connected to drug use have been dropping ever since then. When people predicted that it would do just the opposite, but that's not what happened. So, all right, you've probably heard enough from me, so...
Yeah, we have like a few minutes left. If anyone
okay.
have one more question for 3 minutes.
Sai, I think Sai had it. Yeah.
Sai.
Thank you, Dr. Richard, for your wonderful presentation. It was great to hear the tribalism and how it's affect. So my question is based actually about Oasis and the secular communities itself. So whenever we disclose that we are atheists or agnostics or non-believers, when I mentioned this to my friend, their instant judgment is, oh, are you people get together and be arrogant about religion and put down people, and just what should we do as atheists and non-believers to fight this perception that atheists are arrogant, toxic, and just put down people?
Yeah, great question, great question. I'm not an authority on the subject, but I would say, you know, if people are expecting something negative and instead you're smiling and you're friendly and you're not judgmental, you know, you're also, I think it's important, I think it's just as important that secular people not hide their views. I think it's critical that we are openly secular, you see, you know, but that we can still engage with others, you know, whether, again, these interfaith activities, you know, sometimes Oasis will join with other groups and do, you know, activities feeding homeless people in downtown Houston, or working at the food bank, or doing these other things. And sometimes there are people there from other groups, you know. So I would say smile, show them how friendly you are, and then engage, you know, engage with people, yeah. But, all right, thank you.